Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. I'm Ernie Armstrong, and it's my privilege to lead in Bible study this morning from Colonial Hill. We are finishing this quarter's lessons with our Sunday school lesson today from Lamentations. And a little bit of background, including a little bit of background for Lamentations, might be in order. We've been studying Jeremiah, and Jeremiah has been trying to tell the people of Judah that if you don't repent, God is going to punish you and exact disaster upon you. Well, that has occurred. Remember, for those of you who haven't been with us all the time, the Assyrian Empire attacked and destroyed the northern 10 tribes called Israel and carried them off and dispersed them. Then the Babylonian Empire, which is modern-day Iraq, the Assyrian Empire might be associated with modern-day Syria. The Babylonians became the world power, defeated the Assyrians, defeated the Egyptians, and in 605 BC invaded Jerusalem and Judah and began carrying citizens of Judah off into exile, back to Babylonia, or to the city of Babylon. In 598 BC, Nebuchadnezzar put down a small rebellion in Judah and began carrying off even more citizens, probably carrying off Daniel and his friends with the Babylonian names Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They got new names. That was their new names. And then finally, in 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar responded to another rebellion by the people of Judah, led by Zedekiah, and laid siege again to Jerusalem and ultimately totally destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, and killed many of the inhabitants of Jerusalem and carried the rest off, except the very poorest, carried them off into exile in Babylonia, where they put them all together, which is a difference from what the Assyrians had done. We get most of what I've just said from 2 Kings. Might look at chapter 25. So the prophets have been making it known, and we've been studying from the prophet Jeremiah, that this was going to be God's judgment on Judah for her sins. Then Lamentations in our Bible follows directly after Jeremiah, which has Jeremiah has 52 chapters. Lamentations is written during the time of the exile, which lasted from, depending upon how you want to calculate it, starting with 605 BC, the first real attack upon Judah by the Babylonians, or from 587 BC, which is the final attack, the destruction of the city and the temple. The citizens of Judah were carried off into exile and remained in Babylon, until 539 BC, when the Babylonians were defeated by the Medes and Persians, and King Cyrus, king of Persia, the Medes and Persian Empire, freed the exiles, literally funded them to return home and rebuild their city and rebuild the temple. All we have to do is look at the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, for instance, to see how that took place and was coming along. That meaning the reconstruction of the city and the temple. Lamentations is 5 chapters long. The first 4 chapters are actually poems written in alphabetic acrostics. That is, poems in which each line begins with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Some think the first 4 chapters, the first 4 poems, were written during the first part of the exile, and the 5th chapter later, written later, but still during the exile. The book as a whole serves as sort of a funeral dirge for the nation. The book itself doesn't tell us who the author is, but I believe most Christian scholars, most biblical scholars, believe Jeremiah is the author. There is some dispute of that, but I'm going to proceed on the belief that Jeremiah is the author. So, the dispute has to do with the stylistic difference between the writing of the book of Jeremiah and the poetic writing, if you will, of Lamentations. Both the Septuagint, the Greek translation of what we call the Old Testament, and modern biblical compilations of the Bible place the book of Lamentations right behind the book of Jeremiah. A Hebrew Old Testament, if you will, if I can call it that, places Lamentations among the writings and not among the prophets. So it's not after Jeremiah. All right, chapters 1 and 2, which we are not going to study in any detail, they expressed a deep lament for the nation, for Judah, for Zion, that is Jerusalem, the city that has been destroyed. Chapter 3 is a personal lament, Lamentations, an expression of the pain that the author, and as I say, I believe is Jeremiah, experiences in the context of this national disaster. So our lesson is from chapter 3. We'll look at verses 19 through 33. Starting with verse 19, it really is sort of a summation of the first 18 verses of this deep personal lament at the destruction, the misery that God has brought to his and upon his people. And so we began with, let's look at verses 19 and 20 with that context and that background. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Bitterness, says the New International Translation. Some other translations reference wormwood. Wormwood we see mentioned several times by Jeremiah in Jeremiah. Wormwood, but it's often translated bitter or bitterness. It's a plant in the daisy family of all things, from which people extracted a medicinal potion that tasted very bitter. And so the reference to wormwood is a reference to bitterness. Gall is that which is produced from the gallbladder and would also have a very bitter smell and maybe even taste if anybody attempted to eat any of the gallbladder. So bitterness and gall, as I say, appear in Jeremiah as well as Lamentations, and would be one of the reasons many scholars think they're written by the same author. In any event, this affliction, this sense of homelessness, being in exile, seemed so bitter to Jeremiah as he remembers. I will remember, he says, the devastation of his homeland and his city. He wasn't originally from Jeremiah, but Jerusalem. But as God's prophet, he was there a great deal. And the devastation of the soul, if you will, for resulting from the forced exile into a foreign land. This has been such a catastrophe for the Jewish people that Jeremiah can think of nothing else. The thought of all of this is burdening him, is a burden upon him, is weighing him down. And so we ask the question, have you ever been so tremendously discouraged or depressed because of a tragedy that might have occurred in your life? If so, you can identify. If you have been fortunate, and I think we've all experienced some form of great grief-causing events that might even cause discouragement and depression. But I can think of a couple of current events or examples that might help us relate. One would be the terrible fires that destroyed Lahaina on the island of Maui in Hawaii. Total destruction. Or, in a less totally destructive, but also just as devastating effect, might be the homelessness and crime existing in the city of San Francisco. The federal government has told its employees in San Francisco to not even come to the town, to the city, into the city to do their work, to do it remotely, because it is such a desolate, horrible place these days. Well, if we can imagine what the citizens of these locations, Maui and San Francisco, might be thinking about, it might help us imagine and understand a little bit better what Jeremiah and the Jews have experienced and are going through it. But now Jeremiah is going to switch from despair to hope. So let's look at verses 21 through 24. He writes, and by the way, I'm reading from the New International Version. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassion never fails. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. Jeremiah is writing both to God and to the Jews, or he's speaking to God. There is no denying the terrible consequences of Jerusalem's destruction and the exile of the people into Babylon. But Jeremiah says, by remembering that, I also know there is no denying that the Lord, and it's written capital L, capital O, capital O, R, capital D, and we have been mentioning throughout our study of Jeremiah that whenever Lord is written, especially in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, in all caps, that is the translator's translation of YHWH, Yahweh, God's given name. I am the I am. And so when we read, as we do here, the reference to the Lord in all caps, Jeremiah is saying, God, you have delivered us from terrible situations in the past, like slavery in Egypt, and that gives me hope that you will redeem us again, redeem Israel once again. In verse 22, he spoke of, because of the Lord's great love. The word that translates into two words, great love, is the Hebrew hesed, H-E-S-E-D, or in some places or some scholars write that chesed, C-H-E-S-E-D. The New International translates that great love. I read that it has a great, rich variety of meanings. It could mean kindness, loving kindness, mercy, goodness, faithfulness, or as here in the New International, great love. And some say it is the Old Testament version. I believe it's Martin Luther, and I don't have that in my notes, but I believe that's Martin Luther who says it's the Old Testament version of the New Testament word for grace. But it is also a word that involves action, sort of like agape, one of the words for love in the New Testament. That certainly goes with grace. Doesn't mean grace, but it goes with grace. It's a word of action. It's not a feeling, but it is an expression of kindness, an actual doing of kindness or love towards someone else, more than just a feeling. So Jeremiah is saying that his faith is that Yahweh's great love, his hesed, never ceases, and his mercies never end. They are even renewed every morning, so they remain always fresh. Thus, Israel has nothing to fear. Certainly its present circumstances are terrible, but its future is assured because of who Yahweh is, and Yahweh and Israel are bound in a covenant relationship, even though the Lord is the only one who has been honoring the covenant up to this point. But Jeremiah is saying Israel can trust the Lord to be true to this covenant, to this relationship. We have a hymn in our hymnals called Great is Thy Faithfulness, which comes from these verses, verses 22 and 23 of chapter 3 in Lamentation. Think of the lines, and let me make it more difficult but also more pleasant for you. I'm going to read the lines and not sing them. Thou changest not, thy compassions, they fail not. Pardon for sin and a peace that endureth. Thine own dear presence to cheer and to guide, strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. Blessings all mine with 10,000 beside. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. Great is thy faithfulness comes from these verses we're just studying. And then Jeremiah says in verse 24, I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. Portion is an interesting word, and it has a special meaning. Following the conquest of Canaan, the promised land, the Lord directed that the division of the land should be into tribal portions, and each family in a tribe had its own portion or section of property, of land. So that portion became their livelihood, their means of sustaining life. Aaron and his sons, that is the tribe of Levi, so there really are 13 tribes, did not receive a portion of the land because they are to be the priests. And in Numbers chapter 18, God said to the Levites, I am your portion, Heleq. I am your portion or territory, and your inheritance among the children of Israel. So Aaron and his sons were dependent on Yahweh, on God, for everything, their livelihood and everything else. As well, they were also dependent upon the offerings given to the Lord, which was then disseminated to the priests to sustain them as well. So Jeremiah sees the Lord, or Yahweh, as his portion, his means of sustaining life. His spiritual well-being and heritage far outweighs the physical destruction of his physical heritage, the land, the houses. And so, been saying he is dependent on Yahweh for his portion is to suggest that I trust in and rely upon, and my inheritance comes from God, and his portion does not fail. His faithfulness is indeed great. Great is thy faithfulness. We also will see that the Lord God Almighty, Yahweh, is good to those who wait for him or wait upon him. Verses 25 through 30, let's look at those verses. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. Now let me pause. There's a word here, another word, good, that appears in three lines, one right after the other. The Hebrew word is twab, T-O-W-B. I love trying to pronounce these words. I have to look them up, but it means good, and we'll talk about that. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust. There may yet be hope. And then verse 30, let him offer his cheek to one who would strike him, and let him be filled with disgrace. Let's look at these verses. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. This word twab, T-O-W-B, is used in several ways. It can mean to be happy, to please, to be loved, to be favored, to seem good, to be acceptable, to endure, to be valuable, to do well, to do right. Here, it means that those who wait for the Lord can expect that the Lord will show them love, mercy, and favor. And so Jeremiah is saying, we will get the Lord's portion. Our inheritance comes from the Lord, just as the Levites did, by waiting on him and seeking him, by even being silent. So there is an emphasis here on waiting that appears in the Old Testament in many areas, many times, as well as in the New Testament. So how does it apply to us today, this waiting on the Lord? Well, it essentially means, waiting on the Lord means to live in faith. We rely upon him. We don't have to have, although this goes against current lifestyles, we don't have to have instant gratification. We are to live in the expectation that God's compassion never fails, that his mercies never come to an end, that his faithfulness is not only great, but it is assured, and it will come to us. To wait for the Lord, then, is to live in the certainty, and with the certainty, that the Lord has the power and the will to bless those who are faithfully. It means also we are to seek him while waiting, and we do that by reading his word, by praying to him, by gathering together with others who are seeking God in prayer, and by studying his word and worshiping with them. So, a person who is suffering affliction and homelessness, again, I think of the terrible tragedy of the island, of the fires on the island of Maui, and how its citizens are expressing a profound statement of faith by resolving to get through this tragedy, to rebuild and to go on with their life, relying upon the Lord to do so. That is the sense of what Jeremiah is telling the people in exile, but also any and all of us who may find something discouraging or even depressing. And then interesting verse 27, Jeremiah says, it's good for a man to bear the yoke in his youth. A yoke is a wooden bar that fits across the shoulders of two oxen to help them be guided together and work as a team. It also has an idea of control, God's control. And yet it is a burden as well. And so Jeremiah says, it's best if our youth learn that burdens will occur, even to experience them in their youth, so that they too can grow. They can learn to wait upon the Lord and see that his faithfulness is true. One commentary said that young people have lots of energy, and it's good for them to use that energy to serve the Lord. That may be a sense of what Jeremiah is saying. If they serve the Lord in their youth, then they will enjoy the blessings of these good habits and find positive directions. It is difficult. It's not easy to bear the burdens, and frankly, maybe even more especially for the young, because they are so impatient in many instances. But the wise person not only will bear the burden, but will do so in silence. Verse 28. Their silence will acknowledge both the rightness of God's judgment, and God's judgment on the people of Judah was absolutely right because of their continued sin against him for years. And then they're to do so humbly. Let them put their mouth in the dust. In other words, get prostrate on the ground. It is a symbol, if you will, of surrendering control to the one who is in control. Verse 30, let him give his cheek to the one who strikes him. Let him be filled full with reproach. It should perhaps remind us of what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 39, the Sermon on the Mount. Don't resist him who is evil, but whoever strikes you on your right cheek, turn to him the other as well. Jeremiah is saying we should yield to the one who is in control, that is God. And then finally, verses 31 through 33, and we'll close. Jeremiah writes, for no one is cast off by the Lord forever, though he brings grief, He will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love, for he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone. The Jews are in exile. Their land has been devastated. But Jeremiah reminds them, the Lord won't cast you off forever. Although this has brought grief and brings grief, he will show compassion, and that's because his love is unfailing. He does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone, says verse 33. Reminds of the parent who is going to inflict some punishment upon a child for disobedience, for sins directed against the parent, but does not want to do so. Do you remember? You probably do. You may have used the line yourself. This is going to hurt me more than you. I was a lawyer in training at age 5, and even though nobody in my family had ever been a lawyer. And so my response was, well, if it's going to hurt you more than me, then let me save you from that hurt, and you don't even do it. There is a time when punishment, even the infliction of pain, as the people of Judah experienced, that is for our benefit, and in the long run makes us better people. God doesn't willingly cause grief or pain to his people, but like the parent who is disciplining a child, may do so for their betterment and good. An interesting lesson to close out our series this quarter. I have enjoyed the study of Jeremiah and Lamentation. I hope you have gained from it yourself. With that, let me thank you for being with us and wish you a great day and coming quarter. Good morning.